Go?
Yeah.
Okay. The two principal areas of positive benefit one may realize through work with ayahuasca are in the area of holistic healing and in the area of spiritual development and realization. Often these two processes go hand in hand. And in the concept of holistic healing, obviously that involves healing in all aspects of one's being, physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. And the spiritual realization dimension with ayahuasca is not fully realized by everyone who works with ayahuasca, at least to the same degree. For many people in their early relationship with ayahuasca medicine, their take on it is anything but spiritual because of the physicality of it, because it involves a certain amount of discomfort and even suffering and so forth. Usually the spiritual dimensions emerge a little later after they have purged a lot of the negative energy and dealt with at least some of the deep-rooted causal effects of their conditions that are beginning to come to the surface. And at some point, people began to realize the nature of themselves as a spiritual being experiencing a human existence. And in that process, one tends to become increasingly aware of the nature of spirit as a conscious energy present in everything. It tends to open one to the perception of a basic shamanic concept called animism, which is a realization that everything in the universe is composed of energy that is conscious. And consequently, as conscious energy, it can be communicated with. We can open a channel of communication and a connection that goes beyond the mere physical in nature. So as these realizations unfold, people often experience a spiritual epiphany of sorts, whether they were previously spiritually inclined or not. It does not necessarily cause a person to become religious or to embrace a religious path or a religious dogma per se, but the common response is an awakening at some level of one's spiritual consciousness. And this becomes a turning point in their lives, which, if nurtured and encouraged, and if supportive activities and behaviors follow that in their everyday life, then the usual result or common result is a major transformation, a positive transformation, which leads to better things in people's lives on all fronts. The harsh realities that we all deal with in our everyday life are still there, but our take on them, our perception of them, and our ability to find ways to compatibly deal with those things and work with them and overcome adversity and obstacles and optimize our benefits or our particular skills or abilities is generally enhanced. So the common result of working with ayahuasca is a noticeable improvement in the quality of one's life in the short term, and then that continues to unfold over a longer period of time. For many people, working with ayahuasca is an excellent opportunity to get to know oneself much better, simply because so many things are opened up that are not immediately evident to a person in their conscious state of awareness. So many things are suppressed, and so many things are overridden by the constant barrage of sensory stimulation that we are exposed to in everyday life. So the first priority really in preparing a person to work with ayahuasca is to begin to a process of stilling the mind. And this is done in several ways. There are certain plants that can be used as a preparation for stilling the mind, sacred tobacco being the most notable of those. and simply preparing one to engage one's deeper self in a setting that is relatively devoid of distractive stimuli of various kinds, the trappings of the mundane world, as it were. So working with ayahuasca in a retreat setting, whether it's in a formal retreat or simply in a setting that is natural, quiet, tranquil, and relatively isolated from the stressful energies that one encounters in everyday life, is an important aspect of preparing the setting for good, serious work with ayahuasca. A thing that many people experience when working with ayahuasca is an opening of the possibilities in their lives that they had not considered before. Everyone lives within a certain paradigm based on their socialization, their educational background, their spiritual or religious orientation or training, if any. And so work with the sacred plants often brings people to a point of questioning virtually everything that they assume to be absolute or true up to that point, as a way of validating, as a way of confirming, or conversely as a way of discovering fallacies in those dogmas or in those paradigms. So I believe this is one of the positive and potentially beneficial aspects of work with the sacred plants, is simply stripping away those preconceived notions, the things that we consider to be absolute truths because someone else says so, and fundamentally questioning authority in all its forms and seeking good answers or good responses. All authority is not bad, and some of those paradigms and dogmas may indeed be beneficial or, in fact, may be true. But questioning them is a good thing to do, to find one's personal relationship with it, and also to continue that quest for truth. You know, this is a path for the true truth seeker in many ways, and often people who have a difficulty accepting truth because it's not what they expected it to be, or sometimes we find ourselves confronted with inconvenient truths that are true nonetheless, but are not exactly what we wanted to hear. My belief has always been it's better to know than not, and I've always had the grace and humility to accept what I receive to be true as something that I need to know, and I try to incorporate that in my life, and I try to share this guidance with other people who are seeking the same thing. Well, of course, ayahuasca is endemic to the Amazonian region of South America. It has a very deep cultural history, going back most likely thousands of years, and that human relationship with ayahuasca, and indeed all of the plants of the Amazonian rainforest, has unfolded over a long period of time, and represents a very deep base of knowledge, a very intimate base of knowledge and relationship between human culture and the plants. All of this has been relatively recently discovered by the Western world, and as recently as 25, 30 years ago, very few people around the world had ever heard of ayahuasca, knew anything about Amazonian shamanism, or had any interest in it. This is something that's developed and emerged pretty much in the last 10 to 15 years. This has been the main period of explosion, if you will, in interest in all this. When I started here, I saw great potential for transcultural, cross-cultural benefits, working in both directions. But I also realized the very delicate nature of bringing together two cultures that are in many ways diametrically different in values, worldview, and spiritual consciousness, shall we say. So it was evident very early on that there was a need to form this bridge very carefully, very thoughtfully, with consideration of the potential benefits as well as the potential harm that could be done to both sides of the equation. Western influence has a very poor track record in its discovery of indigenous practices, particularly shamanic practices, and the subsequent appropriation of the knowledge and the resources that had developed over thousands of years leading up to the time of that cultural encounter. So mitigating the negative impact of that connection on both ends became a matter of importance. And obviously mitigating the potential harmful influences of Western values, Western materialism, appropriation and exploitation, and bringing that connection together in a way that incorporates mutual benefits, so that the people and the culture of the Amazon and the plants themselves are not only respected but supported in helping them to be sustainable and to continue the cultural traditions in as pure form as possible for as long as possible. Recognizing that all forms of transcultural contact inevitably produce changes, which almost inevitably have some harmful ramifications. So it really was evident from the get-go that a conscious effort at damage control, if you will, was really important to establish from the outset. So some people have observed in how I work, I kind of have a mandate to protect everyone from everyone, to protect the local people from the potential negative influences of Western contact, and all of that responsibility, of course, doesn't fall on me personally, but to be aware of that in the equation, and also to protect Western people from potentially harmful exploitation and misguidance that they might be exposed to here by people of unscrupulous intentions also. So bringing integrity, honor, and that combined with skill, knowledge, and a genuine desire to help other people resolve their problems and realize their healing is really at the core of the art of curanderismo, the art of healing in the Amazon. The important thing for people to bring to this work, if one comes to the Amazon to engage the medicine and to engage the traditional practices surrounding it, is to bring sensitivity, to bring respect, to understand that one is not coming into this culture from a position or a stance of superiority, to understand that people of Western birth and heritage have as much to gain, as much to learn from people and the culture and practices in this culture as this culture has to learn from them. So understanding that there is a reciprocity, understanding that for everything that is received, something should be given, and understanding that it's not just a one-way street. You know, actually, nothing in life is actually free. Everything has a price, not necessarily in currency, but for everything that one receives, one gives something in return. And so bringing respect, bringing something that helps alleviate perhaps some of the material needs and deficits that people in this culture live with day in and day out, is all part of that reciprocity. Giving something back for what you receive. I think that's the important principle to base one's relationship with shamanism, the sacred plants. All of it revolves around aini, or reciprocity. Here in the Amazon, people who were born here and have lived here all their lives have had the opportunity to work with ayahuasca at any time along the course of their entire lifetime. And yet, many people here are very discriminating in the reasons why they would seek to work with a curandero. Whether or not that curandero would administer ayahuasca would be a second issue. But a good many people are more apprehensive about the people who practice traditional medicine, especially with the master plants, than they are about the plant itself. And that comes back to a factor of trust. And the fact that there are, in fact, two branches in the practice of shamanism, one of which addresses the benevolent service in the realm of holistic healing and higher consciousness, and the other deals with the more dicey issue of power and the pursuit of power. Both of these two branches have different names here in Peru. The path of healing is referred to as curanderismo, the art of healing. The path of power is referred to as brujeria, which is the art of sorcery. So people who are seeking the services of a sorcerer would be drawn to a person who specializes in that to help them get something that they otherwise would be unable to acquire, and often through unscrupulous means. Whereas a person seeking healing would be interested in finding a pure curandero, a pure healer, a person of integrity, dedicated to the healing art, who could be trusted. So trust is the foundation of the relationship in determining who one decides to render themselves vulnerable with in the course of this kind of work. When one works with sacred plants, one intentionally and knowingly and willingly becomes vulnerable to influences beyond their own. In fact, ayahuasca, as other sacred plants, induces a light state of hypnosis. And so when one takes ayahuasca, one is entering a state of a lowered threshold of suggestibility. And this lowered threshold of suggestibility may be used to the patient's benefit by a curandero by enabling the healer to imbue positive reinforcement and positive energy in the patient in order to facilitate a healing process, to liberate healing energy within the patient. A person of dubious intentions might use that same quality of the plant to take advantage of a person in some way. So basically, the curandero and the brujo are using the same base of knowledge, the same qualities of the plants, driven by different intentions. So there are risks in working with the sacred plants. The primary risk is in the qualities and characteristics the individual brings to the work itself. The other risk is in determining the intentions and authenticity and integrity of the person with whom one will do the work, in terms of how trustworthy they are. How much do they know? Are they capable of dealing with situations that might be potentially dangerous or risky to you? Can you trust them to take care of you in a precarious or dangerous situation? All of these things should be considered, and this is not to overemphasize the risks or dangers, but at the same time, it's prudent not to ignore them either. All that said, if one undertakes this work guided by someone of experience, integrity, knowledge, skill, and a genuine desire to be supportive and helpful, and who works with love and compassion coming from their heart, then such people are generally trustworthy and are capable of guiding a person through this process with great success, to great benefit.
Like, people go onto the internet and the first thing they read is all the horror stories. People getting killed or stabbed to death and losing their minds or whatever, committing suicide.
Yeah, 10 years ago, there were no horror stories.
Yeah.
So the horror stories are the direct result of the globalization and explosion of this whole process and the expanded involvement of people who are ill-prepared and unqualified to be doing it is really the bottom line.
Talk a bit about that and
Yeah.
the media backlash.
Yeah, okay. Of course, popular interest in ayahuasca has expanded exponentially in the last 5 to 10 years. 20 years ago, it was a very esoteric topic. Very, very few people knew anything about it or had any interest in it. But as ayahuasca began to become more better known via the media, primarily through the internet, more people became aware of it, and it's created a virtual explosion of interest that's unfolding on a global level now. The primary cause of issues.
That's quite a loud.
Yeah, let's put a hold on that and take two. A common romantic notion about ayahuasca is simply by taking ayahuasca, one will automatically resolve one's problems and become a better person. And there's a corresponding assumption that anyone who works with ayahuasca as a curandero or as a facilitator is automatically trustworthy and competent simply because they work with ayahuasca. Unfortunately, neither of these assumptions are true. In the case of one's personal relationship with ayahuasca and the potential benefits that one can realize from it, ayahuasca is a means by which one can prepare oneself to make the life changes and improvements that they need to make. But the work that one does with ayahuasca is always done by the person, not by the medicine. The medicine may make one fit to be healed or to come in service. It may provide a certain amount of wisdom and guidance in how to go about that process in one's personal life. But no one is prepared to facilitate this for other people until they've completed their own work, which is generally a process that involves time, requires time and energy and effort. And attaining trust in oneself is the first step in learning to trust the medicine, and it also is an asset in helping to find the right people to work with. Simply because a person works with ayahuasca doesn't necessarily mean they're trustworthy. The topic of ayahuasca has unfolded dramatically, exponentially indeed, in the past 5 to 10 years. It probably began about 15 years ago. Prior to that, it was very esoteric. Very few people even knew of ayahuasca and knew anything about it. There was a very small base of interest in esoteric circles, but generally it was unknown to the Western world. As it has become increasingly globalized, mostly through the flow of information through the internet, probably being the primary means of this globalization process, attitudes have changed a great deal. Not only has this medium facilitated flow of information and awareness, but unfortunately it has also been an agent of much misinformation and misguidance on the topic, simply because of the unrefereed nature of the internet and the fact that anyone with an idea or a concept or limited experience or knowledge or understanding of it can post on the internet and appear to be an expert or an authority, whether they know what they're talking about or not. So consequently, people who are new to all this and relatively naive are challenged with finding good sources of credible information and guidance through the mass media that they have access to. So this has complicated the field considerably in enabling people to find the right channels, the best avenues, in which to make their connection. There are really two kinds of people interested in ayahuasca in the broad category. The primary category would be genuine seekers. That is, people who have a genuine, heartfelt calling to the medicine, generally for very noble reasons or motives or intentions. The other broad category is more centered in curiosity or thrill seeking. And these two categories are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but increasingly I see more people coming to Iquitos without real intentions for their connection with ayahuasca. They seem to be more interested in the experience than in the results of the work with the medicine. And this is not to say that there are not, of course, many authentic seekers coming to it all the time. But the demography of the collective interest in ayahuasca has shifted considerably in the last 5 to 10 years. What this has caused is a change in attitudes, not only among the Western people, but also in the local culture as well, because local people see and note this change as well. 15 years ago, the few people who came here interested in ayahuasca tended to fit the former category of seeker, of healing or spiritual realization. Now, people here in the Amazon are increasingly aware of people that many people come for other reasons as well. And this has changed their attitude and perspective on the nature of the Western mentality. I think they probably respect it a little less in general, but they also see opportunities for themselves, economically and otherwise, so there's a very mixed response. On the one hand, there is the potential for material benefit. On the other hand, there's great potential for the erosion of cultural values and core traditionalism in the relationship that people in this culture have with the plants, with nature. And all of this is happening as Western influences encroach on the Amazonian culture from many directions, not just this direction, but this is a contributing factor as well. And I think this is an area where there is still potential to alleviate that negative impact through more sensitivity on the part of those who come to the Amazon to do this work, to realize that they are bringing potential benefits, but they are also bringing potentially harmful influences as well. To be aware of that, to be sensitive to that, and to try to help preserve the foundations of this culture and these cultural practices as purely as possible for as long as possible. Recognizing, unfortunately, the inevitability of change. And that inevitable change is in progress now through this process of globalization, and in particular the globalization of the plants themselves as commodities. The export of ayahuasca presents a problem, an issue relating to sustainability of the resource, and that is especially true as consumption of ayahuasca increases here in the Peruvian Amazon and other parts of Peru. It's also expanding exponentially all over the world, and many tons of ayahuasca are exported every year from Peru, from other South American countries, source countries. How sustainable this constant export of ayahuasca is an open question. There are concerns, simply because the cultivation of ayahuasca is really in its infancy relative to the expanding demand. So right now, I think the cultivation of ayahuasca is not sufficient to meet the global demand as it exists now, which is likely to continue to grow and expand. So there is a serious question about the future of ayahuasca availability in the long run, if sustainable concepts are not implemented, and perhaps some kinds of regulations on particularly the export of ayahuasca outside the country. I'm not opposed to the export of ayahuasca, but the unbridled export without any concept of resource management associated with that could result in depletion at some point in the foreseeable future. There are a number of organizations and individuals who are actively involved in the cultivation and propagation of ayahuasca and ayahuasca plants, companion plants such as chacruna, yahe, wambisa, and so forth, and other medicinal plants as well, to try to offset this growing demand and consumption. This is extremely good. It must be encouraged. Certainly, anyone using ayahuasca on a regular basis should be doing something to propagate or sustain their own consumption, their own consumptive needs or use of the plants. Here at the sanctuary, we've planted many hundreds of ayahuasca vines all over the sanctuary. Our approach is wild crafting rather than clearing and cultivation in the typical agricultural sense. That's simply because ayahuasca is a plant that grows naturally in a canopied environment, unflooded soils. It needs moist but not wet soil in which to thrive. It must have something to climb on. It needs to grow near a tree because its natural growth trajectory is vertical, like all vines. And so cultivating these plants in their natural environment is also very important to their sustenance for a couple of reasons. One is they simply grow better that way, and the other is they take up the energy of the forest, which is their primary attribute as a channeler of energy from the elemental sources, the energy of the earth, the energy of the water, the energy of the air. All of these elemental energies are incorporated and channeled through the master plants. So cultivation, and in particular the wild crafting approach to cultivation, I think is the ideal way to sustain availability of the master plants over a long period of time. In order to do that, obviously one must have a land base on which to work. And when people try to do that on open public land, there's a high risk of poaching or pilfering, or someone else simply stumbling across the plants they've planted and that they're cultivating and growing and coming in and harvesting them in a clandestine manner. So everyone who cultivates ayahuasca wisely does so to a certain degree in secret. They don't divulge the location of their plantings to very many people, if anyone. And that's especially true if they are privy to stands of old growth ayahuasca where there are large mother plants which can be pruned rather than cut, and consequently the very strong energy of the old ayahuasca plants is conveyed through the cuttings or trimming of the branches from these old mother plants, which is much more potent and much more valuable than the energy that one gets from newly cultivated plants. Ayahuasca takes 6 to 8 years to grow to usable size from a planted cutting, and generally ayahuasca is considered to be mature and really ready to use at about 15 years of age from the time of its original growth. And some of these old growth plants, some of the mother plants from which we derive our ayahuasca as cuttings, some of the mother plants are 25, 30, 40 years old based on their size. And these are all hidden away in secret places where very few people know where they're located, and that's very important as well, because if the wrong people find out about them, they'd go in and cut the mother plant, and while that plant might come back from its root, it would take many years to do so. So the indigenous people generally have a very intimate spiritual relationship with the energy of the plants and are much more inclined to harvest the medicine plants in the manner I'm describing. Well, perhaps the most prevailing myth about ayahuasca is simply that all one needs to do to become a better person is drink ayahuasca. That is a rather gross oversimplification, which simply isn't true. Has been demonstrated time and again in people who lack intention or desire to change themselves or change something about their lives, who've taken ayahuasca and gone back into their lives and continued to do and act and live pretty much in the same way as they did before. So that, of course, is simply a reflection of their lack of intention, their lack of commitment to experiencing positive, transformative changes in their lives. Now, ayahuasca does have a function in that process, and that function is in clearing and alleviating negative, harmful, deeply rooted psycho-spiritual energy and impulses and influences that have become lodged in the person at some level of their being. A common reference in the context of work with ayahuasca is the purge. The purge simply represents a cleansing or a purification process. The physical aspects of purging with ayahuasca usually involve vomiting, throwing up, which some people relate to simply as evacuating the contents of their stomach. But many people, in the course of an ayahuasca ceremony, engaging in a purging process, experience that as an elimination of negativity, toxicity, and harmful energy that is lodged in their being. And so they have a feeling that all of that is coming up and coming out in the course of that physical purging. Purging may occur as crying or some other emotional release. Sometimes it involves defecation, voiding of the bowels. Purging can involve virtually any kind of clearing or elimination process that's either physical, emotional, or energetic in nature. So, so the purification process is the first step in forming one's deeper connection with ayahuasca. It's really the essential first step. So a person may come to ayahuasca in a relatively impure state and have an exciting, entertaining, or even highly visual experience that they might find personally gratifying or rewarding in the short term. But the deeper long-term benefits require that purification process and deeper connection that penetrates to the very core of one's soul, if you will. And if that penetration occurs successfully, there is usually a transformation involved which changes the goal or motive of the person for their lives. It creates a more profound, more thoughtful objective for their life. A very important cultural aspect of work with ayahuasca is in bonding. This has been an integral role of ayahuasca in indigenous culture for a long time. That is the effectiveness it has in bringing people together and unifying people and helping people find common cause and common ground and reducing competitiveness, increasing cooperation, bringing forth a feeling of fraternal love and compassion and caring and giving within a social unit. So what we see in our work with ayahuasca with people from other parts of the world coming together for the first time, people who arrive here at the sanctuary as strangers, Within 48 hours, no one feels like anyone else is a stranger anymore. In the course of the work together, going through the trials and tribulations and involving the rich sharing and unfolding and stripping away of the barriers to communication, taking off the masks, as it were, and becoming truly authentic in one's personal demeanor, interaction with other people, forms a cultural bond in a very short period of time that produces lasting friendships that typically last a lifetime. When people leave here, invariably they leave as brothers and sisters. They leave with a sense of love and appreciation for each other. As I tell everyone from the get-go, when you start here, everyone is an apprentice and everyone is a maestro. Everyone is a teacher and everyone has something to learn from everyone else. And indeed, that's the way it unfolds. So it's that dynamic exchange in the spirit of giving, in the spirit of sharing, in the spirit of love, in the spirit of compassion and tolerance for our differences, and appreciating those differences as part of the diversity of the human family. All of this has a very beneficial, positive influence on virtually everyone who does this work. And I think it's one of the most important aspects of the ayahuasca experience, which ideally carries over into everyone's personal life when they go back home. When they return home, they may find their friends and family and people there. In most cases, they're exactly the way they left them. They haven't changed. But as the person returns, they have changed in their perspective and their perceptions, the depth of their ability to empath with other people. And so relationships that are positive and beneficial and strong grow stronger. Relationships in their lives that are perhaps harmful or no longer serving them well are called into question commonly. And sometimes people make the decision to make changes in those aspects of their lives for their own benefit. And sometimes they seize the opportunity to try to become a positive guiding influence for others who are lost in their own material world and have not yet awakened to the greater blessings of shamanic consciousness. It's a growth process. It can't be imposed on anyone if they're not ready for it. I personally do not believe that proselytization of shamanism or ayahuasca is a good idea. I think everyone should come to it based on their own calling, their own attraction to it, without undue influence by other people. And when someone presents an interest in it and asks questions, then by all means provide the guidance and feedback. And if you have some experience or knowledge of it, share what you know. But let the medicine do the calling. And if you want to be a helper in that process, help people make the right connections. But don't try to generate that interest if it's not already present organically. It's a good idea to let nature take its course in that regard. It's always been that way up to now. And the fact that we now have access to such wide-reaching global media, for example, presents a temptation to try to spread this in a zealous fashion. And when that begins to happen, it begins to look like just another overzealous religious movement of some kind that many people will look at with a certain amount of skepticism simply because of that. So I think credibility, to cultivate credibility with this, requires a very cautious approach in how it's purveyed, how it's represented. And certainly it does not represent it well to come off as a wild-eyed lunatic. An overzealous proponent is often the worst advocate for something of this nature. The Amazonian curanderos with whom I work are Don Robert Acho Arama. Doña Eliana is his wife. Don Carlos is his son. Don Carlos is a third-generation curandero in his family lineage. They are from the Lamista lineage, which originates in the Department of San Martin in the upper Amazon. I've worked with Don Rover for almost 13 years now. All of that time in our work here in Spirit Quest, of course. And Don Rover's experience is very rich. He began his work with ayahuasca when he was 11 years old. He was trained by his uncle and his grandfather, both of whom were Banco ayahuasqueros in the Lamista tradition. And he began to conduct ceremonies on his own when he was 18 years old after an apprenticeship of 7 years, which is about average for most curanderos who come up within the culture and undergo a shamanic apprenticeship at some point in their lives. Not all start that early, some a little later, and but the amount of time required to attain competence, skill, and sufficient knowledge to administer ayahuasca is 6 to 8 years of training as a rule. And that's not just a few times a year. That would be doing it regularly every week or several times a month over that 6 or 8 year period. Working with an experienced maestro who themselves have undertaken many dietas. Dieta is the process through which one learns the medicine of a plant. The first plant diet would be ayahuasca, and then subsequently, in order to attain knowledge and skill with other medicinal plants, they would need to do a dieta or multiple dietas with the other plants as well in order to learn their medicine. So that's the process in the training and preparation of an authentic, traditional ayahuasca healer. Not all ayahuasca healers call themselves ayahuasqueros. And certainly someone who simply drinks ayahuasca is not by any means an ayahuasquero. The term ayahuasquero is a special term for a special shaman or curandero who specializes in the art of ayahuasca. Even though most use ayahuasca, not all are specialists in ayahuasca. And there are general practitioners, which are generally referred to as vegetalistas, who have a broad-based knowledge of medicinal plants, and they use ayahuasca generally as their master plant, as a centerpiece of their work, but they work with a wide range of other plants as well. And then there are other curanderos who specialize in other plant groups. Those who specialize in tree medicines, for example, are called paleros. A great many paleros are actually brujos, because the tree energies are often used to practice sorcery. That is not always the case, and that's not to say that there are not trees that have medicine, but most vegetalistas consider the medicine plants to be herbaceous plants, green leafy plants, not trees with bark or spiny integuments like spines or thorns. So there are many specialties in the practice of Amazonian shamanism. And of course, the reference to shamanism is a relatively newly introduced term that 20, 30 years ago was rarely heard here in the Amazon. That's been largely imported by Western influences as well. And people here now recognize that what they do is a form of shamanism, but in their own minds, they generally think of it in other terms.
Why is the West so interested in ayahuasca? I mean, again, it doesn't have to be overly detailed.
Yeah, but you're asking questions that don't have simple answers. Is the problem. I'm not trying to be verbose, but it's really hard to be accurate in a few words without understating the thing. But yeah, I think I know what you want to know.
Why the explosion?
There are several basic interests in that.
And maybe
yeah.
tie in like the demographic of mostly kind of, well, I don't know if it's even true, mostly young men. I don't know if that's true or not.
No, that's actually not true. The demographic breakdown is gender-wise is pretty even. There is not a male bias in that. That's real noticeable anyway. If there is, it's because women, and especially single women, are often less secure about traveling to a foreign country and coming into a foreign environment and a foreign culture by themselves than young males are. Young males tend to have a more adventurous nature and a little more, not in all cases. Some young males are very, very timid too about it, but if there's a bias, I think it's more based on that. A lot more women would come if they knew how secure it is here. A lot more women would come here, for example. Many who don't or who trepidate about it are reserved because they're fearful of even coming to Peru, much less coming into the jungle. And then, of course, with the new this new wave of dark and foreboding tales of danger and so forth. While some of that is true, overwhelmingly it is an exaggeration and doesn't really characterize the situation as a whole fairly. Well, why has the world become so fascinated with ayahuasca? Very good question. I think one of the reasons for that is simply the fact that the Western world has been for some time dissatisfied with its own status quo and with the absence of a meaningful base of reference other than rampant materialism. So many people are seeking alternatives to the Western paradigm, and as the concepts of shamanism have begun to be revived, people are looking more and more to modalities, practices, avenues through which they can engage an alternative approach to healing and life improvement. Ayahuasca is perhaps the best known of these avenues presently. There are others that are also coming to the forefront, but ayahuasca has sort of broken through has broken the ice, as it were, and kind of made the major breakthrough in the collective Western consciousness at this point in time. Another reason why ayahuasca has an appeal to many people is the expectation of a visionary experience, of an experience of an extraordinary nature that goes beyond their ordinary life experience. And unfortunately, in many cases, that motivation is limited to the pursuit of the experience itself for its own sake, which is not entirely a negative thing, but at the same time, it doesn't really speak to the greater potential benefits of working with ayahuasca as a medicine. And so probably the greatest drawback right now is the lack of pure perception of ayahuasca as a holistic medicine, as opposed to an experience. And because Western culture is so strongly drug-oriented in many respects, both from the standpoint of socially sanctioned drugs and medications, including pharmaceuticals and the like, as well as drugs and drug use that's pursued for hedonistic or recreational purposes. There is an inevitable overlap in those perceptions in the Western mind. So there's still a good many people whose primary perception of ayahuasca is as a new and novel drug experience, as opposed to a much deeper, potentially more profound, potentially more beneficial alternative form of traditional healing. So helping people to form the proper attitude, a healthy attitude that is in line with the actual nature of the plant, the nature of the practice, and which recognizes its potential positive benefits, I think is a very important thing. And really discouraging people from pursuing it strictly as as an adventure, as a novel tourist experience, or as a drug experience. Actually, when people reveal those motives in their application to come to our work, that requires further conversation, and I actually decline to accept about 1 person in 10 on the basis of inappropriate goal or intention based on their own expectation or what they say they're looking for in it. So, and this is important to for the benefit of all those participating in the group work. The more we have everybody on the same page with similar goals and objectives, and that in a sincere framework, is beneficial to everybody involved.